Welcome to another episode of One Idea Away, where we're committed to living more fully, deeply, and consciously. Why? Because when we do, we're calmer, we're clearer, we're more connected, more joyful, and much more alive. On this show, we bring you stories of those that are figuring it out just like us, as well as experts who can shed light on the hows and the whys all of this stuff works. So I want to thank you all for tuning in and sharing and reviewing our show. If you haven't done so yet, please drop us a review. Also, subscribe to the podcast on our feed, whether it's on iTunes or whatever app you happen to be using. And if there's something that stands out in the show, do us a favor. If it makes you think of somebody, share it along, because this show is meant to get the conversation started, not just to drop in for a little inspiration. So with that, let's turn to this week's episode. Today's episode is sponsored by, well, us, One Idea Away, and very specifically by the 10 Days to Connection Challenge. You see, we ran this really interesting experience for our community in a slightly smaller way to bring people into greater connection with themselves, to clear away the mental clutter, to detox their hearts so they could be more open and free with the experience of life that they were having. And it went amazing. We received such incredible feedback about how wonderful this process was and how freeing it was for people to really connect to life in a deeper way and move past all the stress and the chatter and all the things that distract us on a day-to-day type of basis that ultimately disconnect us from who we truly are and the life that we love. And so this 10 Days Connection Challenge is meant to help you clear that clutter, that mental chatter that keeps you from connecting to that happier life. It helps you to create the space that you deserve to simply take a breath, to uncover what makes you happy, and to let go of anything that isn't working. You get to detox your mind, detox your heart, and connect to that life that you wish to experience, and learn how to bring it out more in you and in everything that you experience on a day in and day out basis. It's just 5 to 10 minutes a day for a week and a half, and it's one of the most beneficial things you can do for yourself to create that space that you need to connect to the life that's waiting for you. Just go over to oneideaway.com/connect. That's oneideaway.com/connect. And I look forward to joining you there. So several years ago, I was flying high. I had achieved some pretty lofty career goals that I'd set out for myself. 2 young children with incredible smiles and a loving wife who not only puts up with my entrepreneurial whims, but she's even supportive along the way. I was even lucky enough to have a great group of close friends that I've known for decades. It was truly nearly picture perfect. And I was borderline miserable. That's right, it snuck up on me. It didn't happen all at once. It was just a little here and a little there. The things that used to bring me such incredible joy just didn't have the same appeal or impact. The things that once fueled me and brought incredible purpose to my life and my work was just, what the heck? Why am I not happy? In fact, why am I not beyond happy? And then things really got fun. The existential questions poured in of what's my purpose? What's the meaning of all this? Is this all there is? Ugh. Then I walked into the valley of the shadow of midlife. No, I didn't go out and get the red sports car. I didn't ruin any relationships, thankfully, but man, do I wish I had known then. That's a phrase that's all too easy to utter now. To be honest, I know I'm not even out of the full midlife bend yet, but the difference I believe right now is it doesn't seem to bother me the way that it did several years ago. And what if I told you that so many of us actually go through what I was in the midst of? And it's natural. You see, this swing, this transitional stage that life offers us around the midpoint of our lives has been the topic of many stories, movies, and certainly jokes. But it's also the focus of research. And in what I've seen, the research offers more insight than to just those in midlife, too. It's good for quarter-lifers as well as those nearing retirement. And today we're going to talk about all of this, the midlife, the transitions, and we're going to do all of this through the lens of the happiness curve, a very intriguing bit of research and a fascinating book by Jonathon Rauch. Jonathon is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. He's the author of 6 books and many articles on public policy, culture, and government. He's a contributing editor of The Atlantic and recipient of the 2005 National Magazine Award, which is the magazine industry's equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize. And his latest book is The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50. Jonathon, I want to thank you so much for being here on One Idea Away.
I am thrilled to be with you.
I've got to ask, because just before we get into the happiness curve, I ran across something which was incredibly unique, and that's your mantra, which you state as to be Grant, not McClellan. I got to just hear a little bit background on that, because I don't have many mantras that I've heard that are based on Civil War history.
So that could be another half-hour conversation.
I
But
bet.
I am not a natural risk taker. I was someone who got good grades and graduated first in my high school class and got into my first choice college and got great jobs out of college and was having a great career, except I was being the perfect straight A student by not taking any risks. And one day I was reading a Civil War history, and it had side-by-side profiles of two important generals. One was Grant, who eventually won the Civil War for the North. The other was McClellan, who was supposed to win it for the North and completely failed. He didn't fight. And McClellan's problem was that because he'd been a straight A student all his life, perfect at everything, he was afraid to take risks. He was afraid to fail. And I realized that was me. So ever since then, I've resolved to try to be Grant, not McClellan, not to be afraid of failure.
Oh, that's great. That's excellent. So I also resonate with the idea of being the straight A student and following that path as well. But I'm just kind of curious. The little story, my own story that I begin this show with and recap a bit. I'm just curious how many times you heard stories like that as you were plotting out what you were going to cover in the happiness curve.
All the time. I was suppressing a chuckle when you read the intro because it was such a beautiful description of what I felt and what I heard in many, many people. Now, the first thing I say when I talk about the happiness curve is your mileage may vary. People's lives are very different. Lots of things are going on. We're not talking about cancer diagnoses or starring in, a Broadway musical. We're talking about what happens to many people and, by the way, to a lot of chimps and orangutans. Yeah. And it's very much what you describe. It's not a midlife crisis. Things don't fall apart unless you make a big mistake. It's like this gradual slide where it gets harder and harder to feel satisfied no matter how well things are going. Yeah. And then you start to question, well, what's the matter with me? I'm doing great. Why am I feeling so ungrateful? And you feel even worse about that, and it becomes this spiral that can be very hard to get out of.
So how did you first kind of get exposed to the material that ended up leading you to discover the happiness curve and all this incredible research and everything else?
Well, if you mean the research, it's because I have the good fortune to be at Brookings,
right,
where one of my colleagues is a happiness researcher named Carol Graham and a pioneer discoverer of the happiness curve. If you ask how I got interested, it's because I'd gone through exactly what you're feeling, and it made no sense to me. And at that time, the science wasn't there. So I started asking questions.
Interesting. So when you started to ask questions, you're looking at some of what you've been through in your own experience, and you start to get out there and interview different people and see what it is that they've been through. And you had a really interesting way of doing that, of asking people to sort of rate how they would, how would they evaluate each decade of their life, which is a really interesting way to do it. And I'm curious, what were some of those, the common stories, the common scenarios, even the symptoms of what you were consistently running across?
Well, to me, the most interesting part of this whole book project wasn't doing the science, it was talking to the people. Yeah. Dozens and dozens of case studies, and I used a questionnaire, which I sent to I got almost 300 responses. And I found there are two broad patterns that are common. And one is the one that you and I experience, which is people who hit this midlife slump, and it drags on and on. Yeah. And the other is people who had a hard time in their 20s. And that wasn't me. I had a great time in my 20s. But if you had a miserable time in your 20s, then you can still feel improvement in your 30s and 40s. The part of the pattern that's almost, not quite, nothing's universal with humans, but that's close to universal. And to me, the biggest surprise in all of this research is that after about 50, contentment gets easier and easier and easier right through sickness and ill health. It's like this curve turns and we move toward positivity. We experience less stress, less regret. We're better at relationships and at managing our emotions. What we don't know can really hurt us, which is, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, by the time I'm 50, the best in life is behind me. If I'm not happy now, I never will be. Totally wrong. 50 is when the good stuff really starts to kick in.
So what is it that well, actually, let me just start here. What specifically is the happiness curve? Let's put that out there, and then let's talk about how we're dipping into it and entering this trough, and then ultimately how do we exit?
So the happiness curve is the relationship between your age and your happiness. It's really just that simple, except it's not that simple. It turns out that the aging process all by itself, set aside the kids, the job, the income, the health, all those other things, aging itself has this U-shaped effect on happiness. It starts out high at around 20 in early adulthood, but then other things being equal, your life satisfaction, that's your overall satisfaction with life, not your mood. On average, it declines, gentle, slow, but inexorable decline until about 45 or 50, and then it rises again. So that's the U-shaped happiness curve. That is what time in the background is doing to your contentment.
So what's really going on when we, as you said, we go through this period where the degree to which we feel happy and satisfied within life is declining until we hit some midpoint, which somewhere arbitrarily between 40 and 50 for most people, most cultures. What's going on? Why are we essentially getting less happy? Because I know there were some really interesting things that what we'd normally reach for, it must be around stress, or it's around health, or it's around how busy we are. But none of that held true. So what's really going on?
Yeah, well, of course, all of those things can affect your happiness. I think of the happiness curve, as you know from the book, I think of it as kind of an undercurrent. It's how hard you have to row to keep moving toward happiness. And the current works against you until you're about 50, and then it turns around and it works with you. But other things also go on. So what's happening? We're pretty positive about the fact. The explanation is something people are still working on, but the things that are going on seem to be several things at once. One is that as we age through life, our values change. So when you were 25, you probably were very ambitious. You set out some big goals in life. And to motivate you, evolution said, you know what? If I hit those goals, I'm going to be over the moon. I'm going to be joyful and happy every day. That's certainly how I felt. Mm-hmm. But ambition is a trickster. It moves the goalposts. It's a hamster wheel. The more you get, the more you want when you're in the social competition. So by 35, you've accomplished a lot of stuff, but you still don't feel the contentment you expected. By 45, this has gone on for 10 or 15 years. Now you've accomplished a lot. You have everything to be grateful for, but you're still not feeling good about it. You start to think there's something wrong with you. You start to think you'll never be happy. But our values change as we age, and we get less interested in this period. Gradually, we shift away from social competition and toward interpersonal relationships, investing in the people we most care about, in community and giving back. And as that values transition begins to kick in later adulthood, those are much better things for happiness. Human relationships is really where you want to go. Love, if you want to be happy. So that's the complicated one. There's this change in our values, and this middle period seems to be this nasty transition when we're neither here nor there. The second thing is simpler. Our brain changes. It's actually been documented that as we age, it gets easier to be more positive. We're less affected by stress. We're better at managing emotions. You can see that if you compare old people to young people in brain scanners.
That's interesting. Because I want to talk about both of these avenues, the change in values as well as the brain changes to a degree, because it's interesting. I've shared every once in a while, we have some guests on the show that do talk a little bit about the neuroscience of happiness and how all of this maps out to our brain and what's going on there and everything else. And we've talked about how things like the negativity bias are things that have been developed based on evolution. And I'm just kind of curious whether or not they've started to find, or at least start to pose some theories as to why our brains later in life make it easier to see that positive, to maintain a certain optimism, to draw towards that type of connection with others.
It's a great question. Very interesting. Kind of conjectural, but the best conjecture, which makes sense to a lot of people, is evolution. During our mating years, our reproductive years, evolution wants us to accumulate all the status that we can, because status means mating opportunities. So, you want to rock, you want to rule. But humans are one of only about 3 known species. The others are like pilot whales and something else, killer whales, that keep our old people around years after our reproductive period is over. Now think about that. That's weird, right?
Yeah.
And they can't reproduce. Why bother having us around to feed and clothe? The answer seems to be that by moving our values later in life more toward investing in others rather than ourselves, we become assets to the children and grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And that turns out to be true in pilot whales. If the oldsters around actually not only help raise the kids and grandkids, they make the central generation more healthy and happy. So it looks like evolution is doing this to help us survive and thrive.
That's interesting, because that's sort of where my head went, was that, you think about the multi-generations at any given time. If for those that are listening, you've had that benefit of maybe having your older generation or even grandparent generation around for quite some time, that there is a certain wisdom that's meant to be passed around, whether it's generationally or they're the mentors, as it were, of the generation that is now quote unquote in control of things. It's very, very, very interesting. I'm curious to see where they continue to go with the research and what they continue to pose. The other piece, though, I do want to come back to this idea of the change in values, because something else that you brought up is that when we're younger, we have this ambition, and there's also that optimism of, when I achieve these things, wow, the payoff is going to be amazing. My listeners know I've often referred to this on the show as the happy when syndrome. And it goes on for decades, and all of a sudden, like you said, 10, 15, 20 years of this, and you catch on and say, wait a minute, this is not quite, it doesn't quite have the payoff that I thought it did. I'm just kind of curious, what are any of those other, I don't know if the right word is traps that occur, but I know you talk a bit about like expectations and things along those lines, where because of what's changing and the things that are no longer matching the way that we thought they would, we're just not as satisfied as we thought we would be. What are some of those other pitfalls or traps that are occurring that lead us to this trough?
Well, there are a few, and it's good that you asked about them, because the curve itself, it's pretty shallow, actually. It's not severe depression. It's kind of what you described. It's background dissatisfaction. It's kind of a nuisance. Yeah. But a couple traps make it worse. One is the alarm trap, the worry about, my gosh, I'm abnormal. There's something wrong with me. I must need medical attention. No one else is feeling this way. Well, that happened to me. I wasn't even telling my spouse about it, because I was afraid of setting off alarm bells. Right. So thinking you're abnormal is a big part of it. It's like, I'm gay. It's like if you're gay growing up thinking there's something horribly wrong with you, that makes it much worse. And then the second offshoot of that is the isolation trap, which I also experienced. Now, you're not, because you just got on a podcast and explained how you felt. But believe me, I didn't do that. I didn't tell anyone. And here's the problem with that. When this becomes a source of shame, and when you start to think, if I tell anyone, my whole family's going to panic, and people are going to make jokes at my expense about, hey, Luke, when are you going to buy that red sports car? Mm-hmm. Well, you experience shame and isolation, and that makes it worse too. Yeah. So a lot of this problem is not biology, it's society.
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring up the point in isolation, and even I'll share for myself, even in sharing this stories and some of the other things that I share certainly on this show. I do a lot of this after the fact, so it doesn't have the same emotional charge. I don't get on a given day and say, oh my God, here's what's going on for me today. Because we do go through that, wait, am I the only one feeling this way? Am I different? Is there something broken? Is there something wrong?
Yeah. And plus, you're Luke, you're a winner, you're projecting yourself, you're curating your image, you're a master of the universe, you're 43, you're in charge, you're a god. You're not supposed to be vulnerable and going through an unexpected transition in life. That's for teenagers.
It's interesting because it does create that compounding effect, because obviously when I think this is interesting because this part of the value shift that you're talking about is that we go through this transition. We start to feel like we're uncomfortable or something's not right or there's something wrong with us. So we start to pull back and we separate from the image that we're portraying out there to the world. And of course, the more and more which we isolate, the more and more that we are moving away from where our values are actually going, which is to be in connection with other people.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. I couldn't have said it as well myself.
So it has this incredible compound type of effect. And I guess at what point do you remember or you can look back on and say that things started to change? You felt like maybe I might be a little bit more on the upturn of where this curve goes.
It's so gradual. There's no dramatic moment, but ironically, everything went great in my 40s. Ironically, when I was 49 and 50, I experienced a lot of setbacks. Both parents died. I was the caregiver, nasty, bad death for one of them. And my job disappeared and I tried to start up and it failed. So objectively, things were getting worse, but still through that period, I started noticing that these kind of inner voices telling me I was wasting my life, they got less pronounced. It's what you said at the very beginning. I didn't mind it as much. It's like someone turned the volume down on these feelings. And after about a year, I really noticed some change, but I wasn't sure if this was real or not.
Right.
But it was. As my 50s went on, I just noticed the receding of the sense of trappedness. And now I'm 58 and I'm pretty darn sure that happiness curve trap is behind me.
Yeah.
But it's hard to be sure. You never, you don't know until you look back.
Yeah, there's almost this, and I know you talk a little bit about the realism that begins to enter our lives in different ways, and there's almost like that little bit that's in the background of, we think we're good now, we think we're past this, but let's just be watchful, let's be mindful of what's going on, right?
Which ironically helps us to be content later in life because we no longer have these unrealistic high expectations of how gloriously happy we're going to be. Now we know better, and that actually works in our favor because then instead of unpleasant surprises about our state of contentment every year, we're experiencing pleasant surprises.
So let's say, because I want to talk a bit about some of the ways of what we begin to realize as we're on the other side of this curve. So there are things that we could even practice and work towards that help us with this part of the journey. But before we go there, I'm curious because you brought up the work of Jonathon Rauch and the references around the elephant and the rider. And I'm curious if you could just share a little bit of what the elephant and the rider have to do with our happiness and what's really going on here.
Yeah, I'd love to. Jonathon Rauch is a social psychologist at New York University, and he's done a lot of work on intuitions and reason. Where you and I, we feel like we're reasonable beings and all our decisions and ideas are based on reason. Turns out, of course, that's not true at all. Right. So he has this metaphor that what really is driving us most of the time is intuition. And these intuitions just deliver themselves to our consciousness, and then we use reason to rationalize them after the fact. And he compares that to a rider, which is our reason, on top of the elephant. Now and then, the rider can steer the elephant, but usually if the elephant wants to go in a certain direction, that's the direction you're going to be going. And that's the usual situation.
And so our elephant is much more that underlying desire. It's the emotional self. It's the part of us, I think you even referenced that wants to be seen a little bit more in the limelight, or the getting some of the fame and the reward and recognition that's out there, right? And so then the rider, of course, is what we think of as more of our deliberate logic,
right?
In terms of, okay, so there was a quote in here then that you read from Jonathon, and then you added your own thoughts into this that I just wanted to go a little further in. And it was Jonathon Rauch had said, you were quoting from him, that I see my own life, my own mind, much less as a machine, much less as a project or city to be built, and much more as giving myself the right kinds of experience and exposure and letting time do the work. Life is about training and educating the elephant, the rider, and getting them to work together in harmony, or in your own words, to be aligned in alignment. And I'm curious, the words that he used that you really seem to hone in on are the right kinds of experience and exposure. And I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on that of what's the experience and exposure that we create for ourselves that bring these forces into alignment so that we feel like we're going more in the direction that we choose.
I'm going to broaden that just a bit because experience and exposure is his framework, and I think of it a little bit more broadly. I think of it as the decisions we make about our lives and the choices we make about what we're doing and who to expose ourselves to. And one of the reasons that in the course of researching this book, I became interested in life coaching and a fan of life coaching is that what life coaching is all about, it's not like medical therapy at all. It's the opposite of that. It doesn't say you're broken and need to be fixed. It says there are going to be times in your life when your values and your life situation could be out of alignment. And you'll feel growing tension. Actually, you said this beautifully earlier, between what you feel you really want out of life and what you feel you're actually doing. So that would be my way of restating what Haidt's saying. The elephant really wants to go one way. The rider is still pulling the other way. And what life coaching can do is help surface those values questions, which we often bury, and bring them up and start working together with the coach and figure out, okay, how do I bring these things together? How do I move my life toward more where I don't want to be? Midlife, this period we're talking about in your 40s, it's a period of values change. You really are in transition. And, this podcast, super important to you right now. But what if it's a big success, but in 5 years you feel locked in and you want to be doing something else? So coaching is going to help surface those conflicts and help work through them. And it's going to do it with an ally. So you're not trying to work it out for yourself.
So one, I love you respinning it in that type of a direction as a coach and as a trainer of coaches. So I very much appreciate that. And that idea of alignment, and I guess maybe this is part of then the work that follows, or the work that we can really consider for ourselves as we go forward. You mentioned that our values have begun to change. They're shifting from more of that ambition and maybe a more traditional or cultural version of what success has been. And it's now beginning to shift where the feeling of life and the connection, the social side of life has become much more important. How is it that you found, even maybe for yourself, how is it you found the ability to get more in touch with these newer values as they were emerging so that you could align around those? What did that work look like for you?
In my case, it's been less like work and more like witnessing. In some ways, I realized that my conscious self, my rider, is almost more of an observer in this process as I notice my priorities underneath shift. We have a couple kids who live next door. They're now 5 and 3. And this is Michael, my husband, and I. They've become like sources of great joy in our lives. Getting to know them, watching them grow, helping them grow, working with their parents. We have a bunch of neighborhood kids and families like that. And gradually, my shift of where I think about where I'm happiest is not writing some great article that's going to make me famous. It's coming home from work to this community and seeing these kids and helping them tie their shoelaces. Okay. And I'd like to be able to tell you that's because I work at it, but the truth is that I have not been as good as I should be at working to become more connected and more generous. I'm still very focused on my work. It's kind of because my work, a lot of it is political, and the political situation right now. I feel like there's a role that I need to be on deck.
Right.
So I'm hoping to get better at generosity and connection, but I'm glad that those things are surfacing more on their own accord. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think the piece that is underneath what you're describing, and I want to call out for everybody because it's something maybe you're doing without recognizing, as it were, is the reflective portion, right? For us to be able to be reflective is part of what opens up. And when I say reflective, I don't just mean like kind of diving into our own thoughts and emotions and things like that, but just reflective of being able to pause, to be able to look around. And that to me opens up that observer side of ourselves. And when we are more in that observer side of ourselves, that's when we're tapping into more of being in the present moment and tapping into that type of mindfulness. And the more that we are engaged in that type of way in life, there are also those studies that show that that is also a source of happiness for us, right? Because we feel more connected to this moment.
Yes, and you'll find that in the book too, though it's a slightly different version of saying exactly the same thing.
Right.
The bottom of the happiness curve, this slump that I experienced, it's a time trap because by about my mid-40s, I felt disappointed about my level of life satisfaction until then. And I also felt pessimistic about my future life satisfaction because I thought, well, if this doesn't do it, nothing ever will, because after this, I'm going to get old and die.
Right.
So it's thinking about the past and thinking about the future. And it turns out one of the things that you can do that's helpful in this situation is think less about the past and the future. Think more about the present. Be here, put one foot in front of another, try to savor the things, go on every day. Meditation works for a lot of people. I kind of use music in a dark room, though I could have done much better. But yeah, presentness, there's no way out of this happiness trough if you're in it. You just got to go through it. It's like adolescence, it's just a transition. It's natural, healthy, normal. It's got a good payoff. So don't expect to short circuit it. But by not obsessing about the past and the future, that can really help.
I'm really, again, another fantastic add into what we're describing, because it's a great perspective of it. When we think about us as our younger selves, it's where we've come from and where it is that we're going, right? And we're talking about dreams and aspirations and what we're going to do, and we've got all of those things, and that ties into some other aspects of optimism that I know you brought into the book. And yet that we reach this shift where all of a sudden, frankly, the more we focus on the past or the future just doesn't have that payoff for us anymore. And the more that we get present into what's just going on right now, the more that we are fulfilled by that. And
Yeah.
I'm watching this go along, and we go on with even other peers that I've got that are right in this stage of life right now. And as that shift is occurring, and I love the description of it being a time trap.
Yeah. And more good news, as we age into late adulthood in our 60s and 70s, of course, our time horizon shrinks. And one result of that is that we do value the present more. It's easier to be present oriented. That's another reason why, of many reasons, why the emotional peak of life is actually in the later decades.
Yeah. And so I guess there was one other thing then towards the latter part of the book. You're talking about some of those types of practices and directions, be that mindfulness and things like that allow us to start to shift into this happier place. And it goes along with our aging. It goes along with what's a natural process. But I'm just curious then, what might be one or two other practices or areas that other people may want to take a look at that may help them through the transition that they happen to be in right now?
Well, we've covered a few of them. So just as a reminder, coaching and counseling are both good resources. Don't get isolated. However you do it, isolation is bad. Normalize, understand, and internalize. Really read my book, read other stuff, but understand that what you're going through is normal, natural, healthy. There is nothing wrong with you. In fact, if you're not experiencing this, there may be something wrong with you. Understand that the best is yet to come. There's it's not obvious if you're in this happiness trap, but you don't need to be pessimistic. Important piece of advice is step, don't leap. Which is change is important at any time of life. A lot of people need change at midlife or any time, but midlife is tricky because we're bad at attributing the causes of our satisfaction or dissatisfaction. And, I was experiencing time-related malaise, but I was blaming my career. My career was objectively great, and fortunately, I didn't make any stupid moves because I was rational enough to know it. But I was really tempted to just quit my job and walk away, throw all the cards up in the air because it could only be better. It was a path out Well, that would have been a really bad idea. So the advice here is, if you need change, keep it rational, logical, non-disruptive. Build on your strengths and your social capital. Consult with friends and family to make sure it makes sense. That's the way to do change, usually, but especially at this tricky period. And then the final piece of advice is kind of what you said at the beginning. Time is on your side, so wait it out. This is not forever.
Jonathon, I want to thank you for coming on One Idea Away, for sharing this work, as well as sharing a bit of yourself, as well as your expertise.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. For everybody, I guess I just want to wrap up with something that I also pulled from the book and from the Happiness Curve. And it was while Jonathon was having this conversation with Andrew Sullivan, who was the founder and blogger of The Daily Dish, which at one point was it was the world's most successful blog that was out there. And he walked away from it. And in this conversation of, why would you do that? And talking to Andrew, he gave this reply. In my 40s, I felt the attenuation of my ambitions, meaning that the worldly ambitions that I might have had, I increasingly see as distractions from the life I really want to live. To me, this perspective sums up so much of what the midlife transition is all about. The things we've known, we've worked for, strived for, are decreasing in value, while the joys of the types of life we wish to lead increase in value. The relationships that matter now matter in how we construct our days. Our personal and professional pursuits become imbued with the experience of life that we wish to touch most often. And this is a significant change that makes it feel for a time that we were caught between what was and what could be, what we need to do and what we want to do. Who do we think we are and who we actually are? We begin to uncover all of that and transition through it. And so I encourage you to travel that transition, as all transitions, with eyes wide open, not making it more or less than it is. It's transition. And so when you're in the shift, especially when those emotions are stirred up, our elephant wants to run and take the rider with it. That's the time to pause, to breathe, to reflect. Don't jump for the next distraction or the easiest or most convenient feel-good strategy. Instead, take the extra minute, the extra day or week or month or even year if you need, to consider where you are, to get clear on what you're really after, to get clear on what truly matters to you, and to name out loud the feeling of life that you wish to experience. This is time well spent that will pay off in extraordinary ways for you, and you may just get what you wish for. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. I'll catch you next week, and until then, continue to enjoy the journey.
Hey, as this episode is wrapping up, you may be asking yourself, what's next? Well, what's next? I hope that you've been joining in on the monthly live cast that we do for the One Idea Away community. You see, every single month, we gather some incredible guests that are talking about the types of transitions that they've made or are even in the midst of making to create a happier life, to create a life that's more aligned to who they truly are. So we're talking about happiness and purpose. We're talking about community. We're talking about how do we have that modern day success, meaning how do we succeed in our happiness, our well-being, our quality of life, while also making a great living, making the difference in the contributions that we are each meant to make. So when you get involved in the monthly live cast, you can ask some questions of our guests. You can participate with some of the other community members and the ongoing chat that just seems to explode as we get into these deeper conversations throughout the whole hour that we do this. So the only way, though, that you can get these special episodes is when you register for them. It is free, but you got to register to get involved and continue the conversation as we're always talking about. So just hop on over to oneideaaway.com/livecast and to oneideaaway.com/livecast. Join us there, get involved in the conversation, get involved in the community. I can't wait to continue the conversation with you. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you really enjoyed it, do me a favor, let us know. You can keep the conversation going and send us a message on our Facebook page, which is simply One Idea Away. Go ahead and tag me in the post or even just direct messages. Also, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this episode along with someone that you believe could benefit from hearing the ideas and the messages that we got into. That's pretty much why we do this. So you can just go ahead and share it from your app or email it along, whatever works for you. The point is to share, to talk, to discuss, and keep the dialogue going, because it's in those conversations that ideas can take hold and create profound shifts in perspective. That's what allows us to live life more fully, deeply, and consciously. As always, we would love to see you post a review for the podcast in iTunes or whichever app you're using. And until next time, remember, you're never more than one idea away from a whole new reality. This is Luke Iorio and One Idea Away, signing off.